All right, so welcome once again, everybody, to another episode of No Easy Answers, a fucking podcast about politics, philosophy, the human condition. I'm here with dear friends and comrades and members of the Decode podcast. I've got Young Agamben here with me and Q Numina. And today, amongst various topics, which I'll tell you eventually, they're not secret. We're not keeping them from anyone, but we're going to hold out on you for a little bit here. And just say that these guys had a recent episode they did on a French architect named Paul Virilio, and if you haven't listened to that yet, we'll plug it in the show notes and the SoundCloud stuff. I'm gonna toss it over to Young Agamben for a second and have him tell us briefly who Paul Virilio is and why that episode was so fascinating.
Yeah, you're very right. I think you've described Paul Virilio in his truest form, which is that he's actually an architect or an architectural theorist, because his major book, like the book that he's most acclaimed for, is about the architecture of military bunkers, especially like World War I, World War II bunkers. That's the majority of his like academic work has been attributed to architectural theory of the military. But Paul Virilio in, say, modern comparative literature, critical theory departments is known as a kind of media information and military theorist who has written some really interesting books. I would say The Information Bomb is really interesting. Speed and Politics is what he's most known for. And for anyone who is interested in the so-called accelerationism project, he is a genuine accelerationist in that he understands the progression of history to be an exponential result of the increases in engine capacity over like 400 years. So he's really tying the acceleration of historical progress to the developments in technological history as well. And what we like about Virilio is his media theory is I would say either Baudrillardian or post-Baudrillardian, in the sense that the episode and book that Jules is referencing is The Strategy of Deception, which is a great little book about the wars in the former Yugoslavia, actually where I'm from. And the liberation of several countries, one of which I'm from. I'll leave. I won't dox that on podcast yet, but I'll say that the breakup of Yugoslavia is extremely important to my family history as a person. But the breakup of Yugoslavia and the bombing of Serbia by NATO and Bill Clinton represented a sort of strategy of media warfare. In other words, media being the, centrifugal, really, factor in the military strategy of NATO and the West. And he talks about how military will go into increasingly media-centric strategies, which Baudrillard also points out in, There Is No Gulf War, where he watches the whole thing on CNN, understanding that this is a CNN war in many respects. And so if you're interested in modern warfare as it is interpreted through the lens of critical theory, Paul Virilio is the best you can get. He's someone who really understands that on the level of historical, materiality.
Yeah, I feel like Paul Virilio just kind of, I don't have much to add in terms to what Young said, but I think that the reason why we do like Paul Virilio is because in a lot of ways, him and Baudrillard both kind of set up this like ontological framework by which like modern, like the modern landscape in terms of like psyops and information wars in the actual sense, like, like taking, like a character like Alex Jones could only come out of that type of work, something like Baudrillard. And then Paul Virilio, kind of elevates, some of, I would say, like Young said, it's a lot of Paul Virilio's work is kind of post-Baudrillard in the sense that it kind of develops these points and takes them to their, ultimate conclusion. And in that sense, the modern world has a framework by which you can truly view it. It's like modern warfare in terms of not just just logistics, like tanks and bunkers, but an info war in the actual sense. So
yeah, I think some of the highlights that I had to kind of stop and ponder about when listening to that episode from y'all was this the Virilio concept of the absolute weapon and how he quickly sort of subsumes history into this sort of Cold War narratives where he says NATO isn't necessarily some sort of entity unto itself as much as it's sort of a bastard child that was resultant of communism that nobody wanted, which I thought that was a really interesting way to phrase and look at that. And then in terms of the absolute weapon being, air domination in a time when I think maybe we don't think that World War II was entirely a war fought in a quest for air domination. But to tie that into the development of the nuclear weapon and Hiroshima and Nagasaki and, all of that was just kind of mind blowing for me. And so I really think that episode was wonderful. And I, at the start of this whole conversation, which listeners aren't even aware of the topic of what we're speaking to yet, but, at the top of this conversation, I figured I would mention that and give you all some praise for that. Cause I listened to your stuff and I thought it was really fascinating. And, I went and, found an Onion site for, Zlib and got that Virilio work today. So that's awesome, guys. Yeah. But today we are, you guys were kind enough to take me up on the offer of doing a podcast on the general sort of topic of your favorite philosopher sucks. There's a podcast called Your Favorite Band Sucks, and I really like the way those two guys kind of go back and forth, just ripping on the band that they choose for that day, right? And I thought, man, this might be interesting to do with philosophers. And I had a couple that first came to mind. For me, there was Jung, for one, Carl Jung, and Plato, because I've always really wanted to punch Plato in the mouth. But we decided that we would. I think it's kind of low-hanging fruit, actually. But today we're going to shit on John Rawls, and I think for most of the folks in the audience who know who John Rawls is and lean kind of where most of the political leanings are in this audience, I think everyone will get hopefully a lot of enjoyment out of this conversation. So I guess from the start, does one of y'all want to tell me, for the uninitiated, for the people who have no idea who John Rawls is, who is John Rawls?
John Rawls is a very interesting character, and I think this will be situated properly by telling you the story of how I came into John Rawls and how institutionalized he is.
Did John Rawls, was he a womanizer? Or was he involved in these scandals?
Not that I know of.
He
seems like a nerd. He seems like a
really
real nerd
guy, right?
He's the nerdiest guy I've ever seen in my life. But
okay,
I'll just say, so when I went to college, I studied a degree that comes from Oxford, but was, used by this American university called PPE. So philosophy, politics, economics. So you're supposed to study philosophy first, then politics, then economics.
They call it PPE, bro. In this day and age, PPE.
I know, exactly. Okay. And this was prior to, the whole PPE. But the whole purpose of the major it became incredibly annoying to me because it ended up being, you take a philosophy class with a very I would say maybe SOCSTEM liberal woman, and the whole purpose of the course was to deal with John Rawls, and it was to be he's right, because for the second part, the politics part, you were supposed to have already accepted that okay, we're working within the frame of liberalism, so that when you get to the economics part, you're like, okay, we're working in the frame of capitalism, right? And that's sort of the funnel of the major. And I think all of us had problems with that on some degree, but by the end, no one had a problem with it. They were getting good jobs and whatnot. And, that stuff will buy you off from that. But what I remember about John Rawls was having to learn every damn thing about him for no good reason. And so I have a lot of things that I can definitely bring up about John Rawls that I'm happy we're going to talk about Rawls specifically. But I also have to say, you're not a fan of probably cute and eyes like most. We will defend those people to the end. Jung and who is the other person?
Plato.
Yeah, me and Cute will defend them to the death. That's probably why we won't talk. We won't talk about it in this round.
I was too scared to say, like, I was too scared to like submit one, and I figured I would just throw that out there here while we're actually at recording. And I'm glad that you guys bring that up, because like, I don't know, man. Like I know there's a lot of I love theory podcasts and listening to discussions about that stuff. Like I got pulled into a lot of this stuff through like the Deleuze and Guattari quarantine, the book club that turned into a podcast that later became like Acid Horizon and stuff like that. Like I had no idea this like subculture even existed. And I think at the end of the day, man, like I'm too much of a materialist outlook to ever like buy into like someone who is like Freud first. I can follow him to a certain point, but at a certain point I'm like, yo, all of your stuff kind of lies within the unconscious, bro. And for Jung,
Freud
all of your art
so much.
Right. And for Jung, I feel like a lot of his stuff lies in dreams. I mean, there's more of a case to be made for someone like Levi Strauss, who finds his stuff in common mythology or something, I think.
I like Levi Strauss very much. I think that's a good example too, as a better version of both those thinkers too.
That's thank you, because that's what I think that about a lot of these philosophers that get too lost in, but at the same time it's like I'll defend Deleuze, but he's a metaphysician, he's dealing with the abstract, and in the same way that I can enjoy like Baudrillard and Virilio and maybe acquire additional ways of thinking and lenses and ways that enhance a lot of that stuff, right? There is a part of me like for Plato, I feel like a lot of this nonsense started with him though, and a lot of this
all of it started
ideals, it all like started with Plato, and it's like when I walk down the street and I talk to the average person and they talk to me for a bit and I think it's great, and then there's this moment in which I become terrified, in which they say something like like I'm a soldier for Christ or something like that, and in that split second when they say like oh, my grandmother passed away, but don't offer me condolences, it's okay, I'll see her again in the by and by, like for just a moment when that normal person I'm having normal conversations to somehow says that don't worry, I'm going to see this dead person again, loses their sanity. It's like that always has been particularly terrifying for me. So when I think of like the world of forms and I'll show Plato, I feel like you son of a bitch, you took several sane, sound-minded individuals and gave them this incredible power to withstand untold suffering by I don't know, offering them some sort of thing in the next this whole concept of the transcendental is always anyway, but absolutely. I think that's very fair, and I think the assessment of Plato is very fair there, because he's an anti-materialist in many ways, and like you said, he's the founder of all Western philosophy, and it's very important to me. The reason I love Plato in a certain respect is because he was actually this founder of Western philosophy, because he was initiated in Egypt by an occult organization that gave him a lot of his information. That's why Plato is known as a major hermeticist in many ways, and he really represents an idealism and transcendentalism that is primarily esoteric, and a lot of his beliefs should not be taken as related to any material reality, which is why Aristotelianism
is the predominant, sort of accepted belief in Western philosophy, metaphysics, and so forth, is because Aristotelianism is a much more, scientific classification of these ideas, whereas Plato's like, oh, the forms, there's forms, there's transcendent things, there's love, there's like these things that we'll never explain. Is why I like Plato, is like he's the initiation of philosophy as a hyper mystical concept, a concept that comes through initiation, which is why I'll defend him, but why you're right too, because he's so bad for the materialist standpoint, because he's not thinking about that yet, and why Aristotle brings in at least I would say quasi materialist, look, like reading Metaphysics by Aristotle is insane. You're like, this is your metaphysics? This sounds like a biology textbook. It's like this categorized as this. We're going to categorize that as this. It's like a series of hyper classifying, which is good. It's like, but I'm a dreamer, I'm a hermeticist. I think transcendence is still possible, and I'll defend those people to their death, just like Jung. But the thing about Jung that I'll say, and then I should really hand it over, but the thing about Jung is all you need to know is he was an OSS agent, like he's the intelligence apparatus's mystic, which is why I love him. It's like he's the insight into what all those people were really getting into,
Yeah.
I feel like I have a complete different relationship with Plato than probably you guys. I am a respecter of Plato, much like Jung, but I feel like my upbringing with that is a little bit different, because my undergraduate thesis advisor was a direct student of Gail Fine. That's his PhD advisor was. And if you guys don't know how familiar you guys are with analytic philosophers, but she's a prominent figure in ancient philosophy, and so she's kind of up there in terms of Platonist philosophy, at least in the analytic side / historical side. So yeah, I was hammered with Plato. I think that's why I'm kind of fond. I have fond memories of my advisor and things of that nature. And I think that sometimes Plato does get a bad rap because, he does start this kind of canon of Western philosophy. And especially if you're coming out of like the school of thought of like Deleuze and Guattari, you kind of get this like sense of like, oh, well, like, what is it called? Arboreal metaphysics or arboreal philosophy, top-down solutions.
Yeah.
But I think, and I think this is a shift in my thought recently too. I don't think that I've had this take for that long, but I am personally more sympathetic to Deleuze's solo work, which I think is more in line with like a traditional, definitely working within the Western canon, not as radical. I think there are inklings of his thought definitely turning towards, or it plugs itself, just to use the Deleuzian Deleuze-Guattarian language, it plugs itself well into that schizoanalytic school of thought, which it's decentralized, yada yada yada. Won't go into that rabbit hole quite just yet, but yeah, I think that he is a pretty, how would I say, like, I think Deleuze, at least how I understand him, is quite the traditional philosopher. And I know that might like that'd be a hot take. But I think that, for example, he has this paper about Plato. It's I forgot what it's titled, but it's about the simulacrum. And I take that, I've read that paper so many times. And I actually take that the way that Deleuze reads Plato is a materialist in the strict sense. And I've been trying to tie some of Simone Weil's thought into how Plato has a discrete interpretation of, like, he brings it up, I think, in the Parmenides about the receptacle, And that's kind of how to incorporate like a materialist interpretation of Plato. I think that's an entire different episode that on that subject. But I do read Plato as kind of like at least through Deleuze as a materialist to some degree, and I think that's why I can absorb.
That's fascinating. I would love to and I'll look that up to try, because that's a materialist reading of Plato would be most interesting to me for sure. I even get mad, to bring this back to Rawls, man. I even get mad when I feel Plato creeping up in philosophers that I, and one way that I kind of see that happening, I guess, to offer up an initial critique of Rawls, is that, Rawls, just like, and I think you could probably blame Plato for this whole medley of shit I'm about to list, right? But like, when you think about social contract theorists and the state of nature, it's like the state of nature seems like it's based in an idealist sort of place, right? Like it's in a shell, right? Which is why I love Marx, because he comes from a materialist angle about that, right? At least if he's in trying to essentialize human beings, he's going to talk about how we build with tools, and that's what separates us from animals or something like that. But it's not like, the property was a little insecure, or human beings are perfect and then institutions corrupt them. But how this relates to Rawls is in this, in like theory of justice with the veil of ignorance, the veil of ignorance, like ignorance being key word, because I'm kind of ignorant as to what the entire scope of the veil of ignorance encapsulates, right? Because what exactly, and I gave some thought to this, and I thought, actually for the whole Rawls sort of setup of a veil of ignorance, and I guess it's helpful to give for the listeners who, again, the ones that we're trying to be inclusive of all audiences, no matter what level you're at here. But if you think I think of John Rawls as a pizza party. I think of him as if you ordered pizza and it showed up unsliced, which never happens, right? But let's say you have this pizza, you have multiple people who have to eat. You have a pizza and it's unsliced, and now you have to slice this pizza up. And
great example.
This analogy is probably Stephen West. I'm probably just cribbing that dude, but basically, if you had to slice that pizza up yourself, it seems like you would cut that pizza up in such a way that you didn't get to pick your slice, and nobody gets to pick their own slice. And you would cut that pizza up in such a way that you would be happy to receive any given slice of it. And so that veil of ignorance is not knowing how you're going to slice that pizza up. And so this veil of ignorance in John Rawls' sense is meant to be a sort of impartial reigning dispensation. It should distribute the wealth and goods and the benefits of society to everyone from beneath the veil of ignorance. So this already starts to sound like it's set up within an idealist kind of transcendent world of form, sort of ideal space, right? That has really, when I think of what can we take away of that we can apply towards material worlds and stuff like that, I feel like the veil of ignorance is John Rawls's way of saying a separation of personhood, separation of all things that would constitute a political identity in the first place, right? A sort of separation of race, class, and gender, to where if you slice that pizza up, despite your race, despite your class, despite your gender, you would slice it up in a way that anyone would be happy to receive any slice, including yourself. Which it doesn't work that way, because you can't just separate, and then so that thought kind of hit me. And then the last thing I'll say about that is that I feel that Rawls, in an insidious sort of way, through this theory of justice as fairness and the veil of ignorance, and presuming in such a way that we can separate ourselves from the things that constitute a political identity, this is actually a really insipid sort of reinforcement of whiteness. Because whiteness, in a lot of ways, one of the things that it is an ability to separate oneself from one's race, class, and gender. So So like, it's very easy for the benefactors of white supremacy in history to say, like, I am stepping away from my ancestors who owned you as slaves, or I am stepping and separating myself out from that identity, because the very people who have political identities that are constituted of race, class, and gender and are inseparable from that, they can't divorce themselves from that. That is, it's life or death. Like, and so, and the expectation that one should be able to separate oneself is like a reinforcement of whiteness and a diminishment of fucking history and all sorts of class and societal dynamics. Anyway, so that's like an initial critique of Rawls.
Absolutely. I think that's that's the main critique of Rawls in many ways, because my critique of Rawls is I would say, for the purpose of this podcast, let's do 3 parts. And the first part is exactly what you're saying. The idea that the veil of ignorance is, in a certain respect, a divorce from the actual social reality of life itself, I would say, like Adorno himself, I think everyone should agree that like theory should reflect reality, not some ab-reality that you're making in your own head. This weird pseudo-Platonist idea of the veil of ignorance is an idea that is predominant, I would say, in a lot of analytical philosophy, a lot of the idea of this like rational actor, like that, like we can all inhabit the space of this rational actor, when life itself is a series of social factors that make that sort of idealistic theory not even compatible with anything that's going on in the average person's reality. And I think that's exactly what's wrong with Rawls's theory, just like you're saying. I think the second thing for me, though, is the idea that through the veil of ignorance, we would all come to a almost universal standard of basically probability. Because what Rawls is saying is that through the veil of ignorance, we would all look at an economic system through the veil of like, oh, would you rather accept, say, these are examples that, are in the Rawlsian landscape. Okay, 2% of people are very rich. 98% are not very rich. Okay, that's one, say. Another one is, 30% are rich, 70% are kind of poor, right? And then you're like, oh, 80% are poor, are poor, and then 20% are kind of rich, and you keep going down the line with these probabilistic models that are supposed to be through your own, veil of ignorance level rationality. And you realize that his descriptions of what we should want, which are, great, are just like his own sociedem politics, right? He's like, oh yeah, we should all want like semi, distributive politics with, some people can make money, but other people, should get at least social benefits, and you can use Rawls to argue for, universal health care, but, that's basically the extent of what you can argue through the Rawls landscape, which is like, why wouldn't you want any other type of social distribution? Why do they have to decide that like this is like the most rational position, is the most absurd part of it? Any analytical philosophy, I would say.
The way that I see the veil of ignorance, I just see it as like this like pinnacle of like white liberal smugness, right? Like like saying, oh, everyone's the same. Everyone, if it really came down to it, with ahistoricity or this transcendental lack of how would I say it? Understanding. Yeah, or identity. We would all come to this rational conclusion that, we would, like, I like the example that you brought up, the pizza, we would slice up the pizza accordingly to everyone. And I think one of his most famous opponent, Nozick, actually has this similar, I would say, starts from the same presuppositions, the same assumptions about how, the same liberal assumptions, and then develops a far greater, I'm not a Nozickian by any chance, by any stretch of the means, but I think that Nozick actually comes with a better understanding of human nature, still starting from the framework of, what is it called? The state of nature, working towards, some sort of, how does, a quote unquote rational agent determine property, and then, how those agents all develop social contract theory, blah, blah, and develop society through a minarchist point of view. And I think Rawls just kind of, in this Kantian tradition, kind of just develops this, what is it called? Tabula rasa from Rousseau, and just takes that as an a priori given, completely ignores any sense of historicity. And that's the whole point. That's the hypothetical. That's how the whole hypothetical works. But I think for example, Nozick's if you would take Nozick's position, it would be that the individual would slice up the pizza accordingly to their own advantage. So they would obviously if you give someone the chance, they would slice up the pizza in a way in which they would receive a larger share of that, despite everyone getting a smaller amount.
Right,
so
right. It's like Nozick inadvertent support for Hobbes or something, through that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, man. The thing about Rawls too is that he kind of, a lot of what you guys were saying is really generative. So I have like 100 thoughts at once right now, but I feel like Rawls kind of ignores like the cultural particularity of like someone like Giambattista Vico might point out, like there are, and I don't want to get too like this, I think this line could probably spin out like to be very, like the Eurasianists pick up on this sort of line, and they make it, they take it to its furthest logical extent, and it becomes fucked up at that point. But like, Giambattista Vico had this notion that like there are multiple ways to be human, and that every way that one goes about being human is equally valid, and I think that there's a lot of beauty and insight to take from that statement. Now, when you take that and you become like like a monarchist in defense of like, like Dugin, where he's like, well, if the West, what does the West care if we have a king? If we want our president to be sacred, and it's because of who we are as Russians or something, then it's like, well, wait a second, you've kind of taken this beautiful sentiment, and part of that is beautiful, but you've made it insidious on the other side of that. But yeah, I think Rawls, in this sort of, he commits this sort of philosophical error in like an assumption of the universal, going to that white liberal smugness that you speak of, dude, of like assuming that we're all the same, that we are all kind of would be delighted by the same sort of arrangements. And like to that end, I think that like, there is a sort of Rawlsian, I don't know, like a Rawlsian superiority in a way, like Young, when you were talking about how like you go through this course and PPE, and you just sort of gradually accept that, like, I don't know, like you come out of that course, it feels like being someone who believed that the arrangements of a liberal dispensation through the sort of idealism of Rawls would be a system that is most correct, right? But like Rawls doesn't, in the same way that Nozick comes along and points out, hey, human nature is you'll cut up this pie in a way that you would want a better piece. He just doesn't take into account, there's no check and balance over the top of Rawls's system to ensure that this veil of ignorance is ensuring the ignorance to ensure the system works, right? There's no
exactly.
Like there's no over the top sort of ensurement of the system. And I think that's a microcosm of liberalism in itself. I mean, if you listen to someone like John Mearsheimer speak about liberal universalism and the sort of battle for liberal hegemony, liberalism in itself assumes itself to be the superior system that that must quell other systems, to not have meaningful competitors, and to ensure the continued growth of markets, right? Like, which, I mean, we haven't even mentioned free markets, but like, Rawls' system is kind of incompatible with free markets, or at least makes no mention of the brutality of free markets in a lot of ways.
No,
too.
it accepts it as the necessary part of his entire political philosophy, meaning it's the economic organization that will ensure all of this.
Right.
Simply by distribution at whatever we all, through the veil of ignorance, agree to, which is, like you're saying, absurd, because the veil of ignorance strips away everything that's actually important in some sort of democratic, decision making as to how we should distribute goods. Like, how can you have how can you have reparations for former Black slaves through that framework? Or how can you have like a political program that deals with the racial or even like disability parts of being a human? Like, how do you actually figure that into a political philosophy in which we are all supposedly the and that's where it becomes white, is like the idea of just being like some outsider that you can view, which is very, to me, telling psychoanalytically of like Rawls's position. He's like, when we're thinking of Rawls, we're thinking of his position. Well,
yeah,
that's the veil of ignorance. Is like, are you like a nerdy white professor who has very little stake in the lives of all of these people? Like, what's the best you can come up with? And this surely is it. It's just like, he needs to keep his job. And I think that's what everyone needs to realize at the end of the day, is it's like, as far as he goes, is a justification of capitalism at this almost, I would say demsoch political level.
Now, I might be like confusing a bit of like a theory of justice with another one of Rawls's work, political liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
But the Rawls, would say that his philosophy is, important to a pluralistic society, and that, you would use his sort of idealist arrangements in order to, quell like major disagreements and allow members of a pluralistic society to coexist despite very hard differentiating opinions on topics, right? And so I get that, but like Rawls also said that political liberalism is based on the idea of public reason, which is like that when making a political decision or decisions, people should rely on arguments and reasons that can be accepted by all reasonable members of society. I want to put quotes over reasonable members of society, regardless of their particular moral or religious beliefs. And the concept of public reason in this sense, like public reason is terrible, actually. And I think it cuts to the question of like, what do we consider a meaningful democracy if public opinion is not the thing that we should abide by as sort of the thing that needs to be fulfilled in order to be considered democratic, right? Because like, if you think about the ways that public opinion will shift in just a few short years or decades, like, what comes to mind for me is something like, an example of like a Jim Carrey movie where like, in the 90s, when he made Ace Ventura Part 1, I think we all had a few years where we really enjoyed that movie or thought it was dumb or whatever, but it was part of the popular culture. And there's this one scene that's a very damaging scene in which, for members that listen to the trans community, I mean, you guys know the scene that I'm talking about. And people have been hurt by that. People were hurt by that then. And but that was like a major marketed, Hollywood movie, right? And it seems like today, I don't think that movie could be made, or at least not that scene, not that plot, not that end point in that movie. So just the way that public opinion has shifted from that, right? If we're going to take Rawlsian shit and say, okay, well, public reason is what we base this on. I think it's a deeper answer towards like the concept of democracy, but I think that it's another way that Rawls kind of shows maybe a lack of forethought in how he wished for us to find the ultimate decider on this stuff, and it's interesting how he comes up with like, oh well, we should definitely have some sort of like end all be all authority of like public reason, but he never says anything about that towards like the veil of ignorance, or like going back to the checks and balancing we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Going back to what you guys mentioned earlier about the veil of ignorance, kind of establishing itself without any like meta level to kind of assert itself or to kind of check itself from, ensuring that that it produces the proper outcomes, is that Rawls does kind of have two principles by which he kind of establishes the veil of ignorance, which is, the first one is, the like liberty, like, obviously working from a liberalist point of view, which is liberty. And then the second one is equality, by which, liberty is justified. And, I guess the questions that I would ask is, because, those are essentially two, I don't want to call them axioms, but essentially two presuppositions, that those are kind of givens, right, for this whole thing to kind of work for.
But they're set up in like a inversely proportional relationship.
Yeah.
Like the more equality you have, the less liberty you have, supposedly, in this entire conversation, which I don't know that's like,
doesn't make sense.
And the way this is staged for a lot of political education is fucked up, in my opinion. But yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think the big question is what makes equality good?
Yeah.
A priori. I think that's the biggest question, and I think Rawls fails to answer because essentially he establishes equality based on liberty, right? That's the whole point of distributive justice, that you would want those who are disenfranchised to have the same opportunities to express or to propagate the self-respect, which is the basis for liberty. At least that's how Rawls sees it, which is if you don't have the same opportunities, freedom of speech, opportunities to the basic opportunities of democracy, then you are not actually, you don't have the fair society that liberalism advocates, at least to express, libertarianism or liberalism in that sense. But I think it begs the question: what makes equality in itself good?
Right.
And then in that sense, and I'm not even trying to poke it as in saying that inequality in itself is good, right? That would be the libertarian position, which is that.
But that's also Rawls's position, right?
That
some people deserve more. Still, in his distributive system, he comes up with, we should that's why I keep calling him a socialdem. We should have like taxing of the rich, but there should be rich and there should be a working class, which is one of the big gaps, I think, too. And because like we were saying, like, what is equality then? Like, what is an equality of even reason through this veil of ignorance? It's his reason, really.
He almost presents that, it's that meme that Jordan Peterson comes up with, which is like, what the communist wants is equality of outcome.
It's exactly.
Like,
well, that is his thing, kind of too.
Yeah, no. I mean, it kind of is, but it's cognitively dissonant, because if you still advocate for the rich by which you tax to then distribute that wealth, you, by necessity of that system, you have to have elite class, so to speak. You have to have a class distinction.
John Rawls, closet Nietzschean,
Yeah, exactly. In many ways.
Which then it destroys, or at least it kind of presents like a bug in the system, because if you do have this even without the veil of ignorance, if you if you then step into this whole notion of this inequality that exists, this gap that you brought up, then by necessity of that gap, you already established something in the system by which the veil of ignorance can no longer take hold, which is that there is a class distinction.
Yeah, exactly.
And you essentially have to erase that class distinction, essentially establish false consciousness for that system to work. By definition, he is a socialist, or
right. He's the absolute like king of supporting the idea of capitalism that's compatible with socialism, even, and you're like, you're making so many assumptions, like you've made the exact right point of what I'm saying about like the distributive outcomes. Like they don't make any sense either from even like Nozick destroys him from a libertarian far right even perspective, and his stuff doesn't make sense generally in this distribution that's like, oh, people would just accept this, and I think another big aspect of this that I don't get is he accepts a very, very like pro-capitalist, even liberalism standpoint, where he combines the idea of money and freedom together, and he calls them primary goods. And this is a big assumption in all of Rawls. He says everyone should want more primary goods than less. And this is like, unfortunately, it's what I wrote, like, my like freshman year, final on, but it's like, the idea of wanting more primary goods than less is a political statement, right? From both my example would be like, obviously a communist, or I'm just saying like, Franciscan ministers would say that's not true. Buddhist monks, there's tons of people who would not agree with that political statement, that is a primary point in Rawls's arguments. And he makes several of these, these are proliferated throughout the entire book of Theory of Justice. But this is one example of like actual political assumptions that he is claiming to be apolitical.
Did you guys know that John Rawls also endorses stochastic terrorism?
That would be based.
Right. So what I mean by that is that like, like the emphasis of like political liberalism being important to civil liberties and political freedom. It's all based on the idea that people should be free to hold and express their own beliefs and values as long as they do not harm others. And for those of you out there who have term papers to write and don't know about ChatGPT yet, one way to write a term paper is to just put quotes on a word that's doing a lot of work in a passage of your author and then think about it real hard. And so I just put quotes over that, as long as they do not harm others, right? Like, first of all, what that's a lot of work that harm is doing. Like, what is harm? Like, what are we free to do in society so long as we don't harm other people? Like the degree of harm, I wonder, in terms of stochastic terrorism, that's maybe not a measurable harm in terms of what is a perniciously harmful effect on society that is not easy to measure or calculate or assign a value to. Things like this, I don't know, maybe that's a minor critique of this stuff, but I just don't think that given Rawls's position and sort of failure to understand that introducing the veil of ignorance is an erasure within itself, failure to sort of answer the question of why is inequality or why is equality good a priori, things like not assigning a sort of I don't know, for not being a closet Hobbesian and assigning a Leviathan over the top of the veil to ensure its enforcement. Stuff like that. I don't think that Rawls would have considered stuff like this, or it would have considered the degree of what constitutes harm in that realm. So
I have two quick points because I do want to let Young take. I know that he has something to say probably about this, but
no, go ahead.
Absolutely. Two quick points, which is, I absolutely hate when, at least like this type of analytic philosophers, they're not even deliberately hiding. It's like this straight up utilitarianism. But the thing that I hate about utilitarians, is that they have this utility calculus. They're like, well, we just need to minimize, overall, what is it called? We need just to maximize overall well-being. But it kind of, Rawls starts off his argument of distributive justice, or what is his general theory of justice? I don't know what he calls it in his book, but with these two principles, right? The principles that I aforementioned earlier, equality and liberty. So you have to predicate your utility on transcendental values. You don't even have to, like, it's almost like they state that it's just overall well-being. This is the most rational position. Every person is always wanting to maximize their self-interest. And by doing that, by diminishing the amount of harm or overall harm, you naturally come to this conclusion that, you have to reduce the harm and maximize, what is it called? Maximize happiness or whatever you want to quantify it.
Primary goods. Everything that you ever love is a primary good, apparently. Rawls.
But then they don't explicitly state or they almost kind of like completely side bracket that. What are those primary goods? Are they an end in themselves, or are they a means to an end? And if they're a means to an end, then your utility calculus, your utilitarianism is predicated on an entire different system. You're not even bringing up, these transcendentals, which are virtues in and of themselves, which have nothing to do with rationality, first of all. Because I love the point that you brought up, Young, about, like the Franciscan school. There's the Spanish school, what is it called? Salamanca school, which is, just a type of kind of like, what do you even say it? It's like basically like Catholic economics. Which is, they're kind of
service oriented.
Yeah. So they want to maximize the human aspect of the economy, which is, how do you get the economy to work to maximize eudaimonia?
That's what Franciscans do, It's just
literally.
How can we serve the most amount of people at one time? This is the Catholic sect that is most specified on service, And that's what's so interesting. It's like, so you're not including everyone in this argument. You're including the majority in your own mind that would agree on this distribution outcome, or the outcome of which you're saying more primary goods are better than less primary goods, even though we're going through, another example is like mass amounts of climate change. Like, we might need to restrict both the economic output and the, behavior of human beings for the savior of the planet, Like, there might not be an ability to accept, you can spend whatever you want, or you can, throw away whatever you want, any further. That like prime liberty and economic outcome might not be like feasible in the future, which makes no sense.
Well, I think there's even like a bit of exclusion in the language in which Rawls's ideas are described. Like, even going back to the idea of public reason, which is the idea that when making a political decision, people should rely on arguments and reasons that can be accepted by all quote unquote reasonable members of society, which, like Michel Foucault has entered the chat. So like, so I think of, a lot of this stuff is predicated on, distinctions of inclusion and exclusion. And I would be curious, I wonder if I'm sure he did, but you have no idea how much as much as I don't like John Rawls And as much as I'd like to grill him myself in many ways, I feel like it'd be far better if I could set up a situation in which like we could inject like Carl Schmitt in the background of John Rawls as he's writing this stuff, sort of like being like, just Robert Nozick is already a little bit of like the devil on his shoulder, being like, listen, man, I'm going to cut this pizza up and I'm really going to take the bigger slice, right? And it's
listen to this though.
Yeah.
About the pizza and about Robert Nozick, which is the most interesting part, I think, of any part of this is, so when we're talking about Robert Nozick, we're talking about this, I would call him anarcho-capitalist libertarian philosopher.
Yeah.
And he wrote this book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, in which he figured everything is right. If we do the human-to-human transactions that are based on complete rationality, which is what we're talking about with Rawls too, which I think is so interesting, is that both him and Rawls are analytic to a degree that is nonsensical, because they both are accepting things that don't actually make sense in the real world. And for Nozick, it is the idea that everybody who makes a transaction has the same amount of information, right? No, capitalism is entirely based on asymmetrical information. That's how you extract surplus value, especially in the new world. Especially with I'll give an example, car loans, like 15% car loans, bad mortgages. Like these are how people make money, based on the ability to extract surplus information from people who don't know that information, right? And that's why his libertarianism was wrong. And I'll give him slight credit. At the end of his life, he wrote a book about his whole life, and he basically actually rejected a large amount of his philosophy, being like, I realized none of this actually has to deal with the real life, and no one will accept that yet as interesting in this guy's life. He's like, look, I was an academic. I was writing these things that I don't actually believe in, that are not true, And he ended up being like, people are more important than these theories. And you can read his final autobiography, because he wrote it himself. It's called like A Life, something along those lines. And he rejects a large amount of what you're reading in even Anarchy, State, and Utopia as like, oh, this is right,
Wow. I want to say a couple different things about all those, but I spent some time like in Vermont on a cabin last year, and I had to take some reading material with me. At the time I had a couple books in front of me, and a couple of them were on fascism, and I can't just go read about fascism by a lake. I'm gonna choose different. The other book I had was Todd May's book on Jacques Ranciere, and and so I really gained it wasn't the point of the book, but I gained like a more powerful critique on Rawls sitting on that lake reading that book about, like liberty versus equality sort of things, and the ways that, as Todd May talks about like how, Nozick would have us achieve liberty through actually like living, and it's through liberty that like equality is achieved, I suppose, and whereas, and the thing he said about Rawls, which I thought was probably most powerful, was that freedom and equality and the things that are to be dispensed, or the justice to be distributed in the Rawlsian language, is treated as an end, meaning that like one is to like stand by and receive it. And then like, so if you think of it as treating that as an end, and then he focuses over on Rawls, and he says like equality and justice is more of a process in the Nozick sense, right? And then he switches to Ranciere, and he says that Ranciere would have us take these freedoms as a presupposition. And rather than have them have a process or an end, we would presuppose our own individual liberties and equality and that sort of stuff. And I think that's really powerful and speaks to the sort of, always unanswerable questions of like why Americans are so fucking politically unconscious and why hasn't there been a revolution and stuff like that. And it's, towards the end of, speaking of like Rawls developing like a false consciousness, this veil of ignorance, man, I think that's primarily what it's like fairness and justice and equality as an expectation and a promise yet to be fulfilled. And that's tragic. And yet we're still treating them as an end. And I think Rawls does a great deal of theory and sort of, builds a lot of scaffolding to allow us to sit and wait to receive,
Mm-hmm. I think that's very true. And I'll go back to something Cute said that is very true, where the whole point of even Virilio and of everything is information war. The idea that information is war. And who gets such information is a product. Have you ever read Clausewitz, the military theorist?
No.
Great guy. You should read it. I mean, a lot of it is just about like how you should, tie up your horses or, deal with your horses. So don't read those. But like he next to Sun Tzu is the, head of war theory. And what he says is basically that the politics is the extension of war by other means, is the reverse quote, I'll say.
Right.
Because what he says is war is the extension of politics. But I think he really figured it out, that they're two of the same things. Violence and the extension of a political philosophy against people will lead to their, violence against them.
I think that speaks to just like, Foucault's critique. Again, Foucault enters the chat, which is, that's why he comes with that. And it's kind of like a crude aphorism that I think that people kind of use to distill Foucault's philosophy, but is that that knowledge is power,
right?
But just to use it as an analogous way to get to this analogy that I'm about to make, which is that it's that whole notion of how like the originary act of language, which is or at least the written word, which is somebody has to write something to convey a message or to send it to someone. And, the person that interprets the message has a certain power dynamic over the person who conveys that message. And to the person who's relaying that message, they suddenly have a disproportionate or asymmetric power relation to the one receiving the message. In this case, a king sends a message to another king, the person reading that message in another language, or if it's let's say the king is illiterate because, it's the first act of literary language, then there's an asymmetry there. There's just based on that action, and I think how that asymmetry is almost like a transcendental act, which is like you mentioned, Young, which is there's always going to be a instance in which someone has a disproportionate amount of information. It's information all the way down, in which they can use that to their advantage. And in that sense, that's where I think Rawls falls short, which is at least Nozick is aware of that asymmetry. Whether he's right or wrong about 90% of his philosophy, that's a different question. But at least his like presupposition is actually grounded in some notion of historicity. Not 100%, but at least there is some, and that's from someone coming from the right. I
know he's the far right.
And then just another quick point, which is just at least how it plays itself out, and we can see this in our in our shitty democracy, which is time preferences, which is, you're always going to, you ask a person on the street, do you want $20 now or do you want $20 later? With the same guarantee that they're going to get those $20 regardless of what time they pick.
Yeah.
I would say almost like 90% of people are going to pick $20 now. Mostly people don't have that time preference that what is it called? They wouldn't push their time preference or delay their time preference, which is the same way in how it works with governments. It's like if you can maximize the goods and services and extrapolate the largest amount of surplus value, are you going to use that to maintain societal levels optimal for generations to come? Or are you going to use it are you going to burn all that out to maintain the current living standards for people, for a certain type of people, for a certain class of people? I think the obvious one is you're going to burn that cash out now.
Exactly. I think that's the most important part of what we're talking about in terms of how the system that is accepted by Rawls, which is like the capitalist system that we're talking about, but also like at least Nozick understands that, and he's arguing from the perspective of, the most conservative standpoint in history, which is like every transaction that happens under capitalism following these parameters, the, rational symmetry of actors is good, and any distribution of that wealth that's distributed through good interactions is inherently immoral. That's the big argument of Nozick. And the thing about Nozick is he shows you that like the entirety of capitalism is actually wrong, and that none of these arguments that he makes are right, or in the sense of Adorno has a one sentence quote that I loved, which is that theory should reflect reality. And this is not a reality. This is a idealism of capitalism that is used to justify the kind of exploitation of everyone on a simultaneously labor and informational level. And what he's getting at is, you should accept everything, everything is, at this level of rationality. And the problem is it's the same weird academic rationality that Rawls is talking about, where he's like, you should accept everything from this weird socialist perspective of me, this 1970s academic, as the veil of ignorance. Whereas the veil of ignorance actually is only used to justify a very specific standpoint, which is, social democratic liberalism. It's not used to justify communism. And there's a reason for that,
And I think there is room for a certain type of idealism. I don't want to say that, like idealism in itself, and I don't mean like the idealism, like the metaphysical idealism. I don't think that's what you were referring to either. But like, that idealism in the sense that utopianism, right? Working towards utopianism. Because, for example, like somebody that Deleuze kind of looked up to a lot was, Louis Althusser. And he was an idealist of sorts. I think his communist project, or at least how he was a self-acclaimed communist, was that, idealism in itself, it can still be materialistic. And I think, that's where we get a lot of like Deleuze's interest in Althusser, which is that you can't, the ideal isn't something that it's not like a teleological end that you work towards. It's that, that virtual aspect of the object is already here. Like it's already tangible. You can already work towards it. It is materialist. It's materialist in a robust sense of the term. And I think that's the type of idealism that I think me and Jung kind of are at least attracted to, which is, it's like, what are the tangible conditions taken into account, like a historical materialism, a sense of differentiating inequalities that people already have, and how can you establish, a true utopia? Not like utopia in itself isn't an end. It isn't an end in itself. It's it's something that you actively, like, tangibly work at.
Salvation, some sort of infinite salvation that you're working towards, which is why I also hate, I think we mentioned in the chat, Habermas. Habermas is the liberal version of salvation through communication. He's like, eventually we're going to get to a point where we can communicate equally between everyone. I'm going to use a Trump voice just because, like, that's kind of exactly what he's going to be doing. And it's like, we're going to get everyone equal on the level of communication. And then at the end of the day, it's like the only people who read Habermas essays or books are people like I'm in academia. I don't read that shit. It's like maybe 100 people. It's like, how is that helpful in any degree? Like, a liberalism of equality at the level of academia never works at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think there's a few more critiques here. I mean, we're not short on any critiques of Rawls at this point. But
Yeah.
All right. But I would say the one thing I think that we haven't mentioned is that, so far everything that we've talked about in terms of the veil of ignorance and the person slicing the pizza and the things that political liberalism aims to achieve, and like the resolution of deeply held beliefs that conflict within pluralistic societies, like all that we've mentioned and covered, man, all that is, largely based in person-to-person individuals, based in the ontology of a singular, like, person or a member of society. But I think the thing that Rawls' theory is trying to achieve is really more of an institutional sort of thing. And to that end, I don't know that you can neatly, I mean, it doesn't transfer, you can't just plant that on top of it. Now that you've accomplished this theory of justice, Rawls, you can't just transplant that over from people to institutions. And I think there's a lot where it would fall short on that sort of stuff. And
that's exactly where we connect, is that Rawls is transferred to institutions. From what I told you is, like, Rawls is the only person I was allowed to learn for a year, which is insane.
Yeah.
I had to write everything I ever knew about Rawls and everything I hated about him. And it's like, why is that the guy, Because this is the answer of liberal arts institutions to, economic theory, which they also made me learn at the end that, disproved it all, supposedly. But it's like, why learn Rawls over, and I even asked my professor, I'm like, why not at least add Marx,
Sure.
One essay of Marx, one thing, and it didn't work. And so I'll just say, and I'm sorry to be so loquacious on this topic, but if you're going through this right now and you're learning Rawls, and you're in, say, college, or you learned Rawls in college, the best anecdote I can possibly give to you is reading as much of G.A. Cohen as you can, which, I'm not a socialist, I'm, I'll hint slightly more left of that, but I'll just say, as a argument, G.A. Cohen, the socialist, is the best, sort of answer to the insanity that is the philosophical arguments of Rawls or, Nozick or any of these people.
Yeah, I'll just say as a kind of a quick summary of a lot of the stuff that we've talked. I mean, Rawls has a lack of foundation. I mean, he kind of assumes a veil of ignorance without providing a clear explanation of how the situation could, guide moral and political decision making. There's a limited scope. He says nothing about justice beyond our own borders. That might be the reason why he's taught so heavily. I think it's limited appeal, man. Like, there's a whole lot of people who don't share his values or philosophical assumptions. Lack of realism is it doesn't adequately address real world changing challenges and complexities of politics, and a sort of insufficient attention to power. There's a lot wrong with Rawls, and he is held up on a pedestal. And I think a lot of ways, I think maybe some of the antidote to Rawls is Lenin. Like, State and Revolution is a lot better read than this bullshit.
Absolutely.
And that's a rather obvious statement, but I mean, I don't know. So all this stuff being said, man, one more thing I wanted to say is that we briefly we talked some shit about utilitarianism, and I think I want to say this is Derek Parsons who came up with this concept of the utility monster. Are you guys familiar with this thing?
I don't think I've heard of this.
So like under the utilitarian model, the reasoning is that one would make decisions based upon the greater benefit of the whole, right? So like the utility monster is this thing that as a general rule will always benefit as a whole more. So like under the rules of utilitarianism, you would indeed be like morally obligated to serve anything that benefits the whole to the utility monster. And there was another, and I hope this is Derek Parsons that like did this, that I hope that's correct anyway. But the other part of the utilitarian sort of the mess of logic they can fall into was he had this thing that he called like the repugnant conclusion. And if I'm understanding this correctly, it was like a hypothetical situation with like Earth 1 and Earth 2. And basically like Earth 1 was like our Earth, and Earth 2 was like an experimental plane where we could fuck around and figure out how to increase overall happiness. And it got to where, the repugnant conclusion is that, like you could, like as a, because, okay, so I guess this premise is like, under these guidelines, if we were going to increase happiness, it would make sense to have, if we had more people to experience happiness, then happiness overall would increase. So by that rule, if we made a rule where everyone just started reproducing as much as they could, like Earth 2 would fill up with a lot of happiness. And so utilitarian logic would make that solvent. And then it gets more ridiculous from there, in that one could feasibly increase overall happiness by way of getting rid of people who did not experience happiness. That detract from happiness, which was the repugnant conclusion, which was a really wild sort of utilitarian thought experiment to read about.
Yeah, that's insane. That's crazy.
Yeah,
I will give slight credit to Rawls. I really do appreciate that he does deconstruct complete utilitarianism, although he doesn't understand how much of it he's sublimated. He does say, like, oh, utilitarianism assumes that, like, people can be measured, in such a way. And his response is basically, I can measure them better. I can do it better. Primary goods is a better metric. It's like,
hang on a second. This is really funny. Guess what? It's not Derek Parsons who came up with the utility monster. I'll give you a guess who it was.
Who?
Robert Nozick.
Oh, Nozick definitely would have done that. Have you ever heard of his Wilt Chamberlain example? That's his famous example.
Oh, is that like the I don't know, people with physical abilities, or that sounds terrible.
It's capitalism argument.
Capitalism, like the willing and able and the ability,
it's famous argument, but it's more about value, and it makes very little sense, but it makes sense to like a normie. I feel like it's like, so you go to a basketball game, right? And Wilt Chamberlain is paying, or playing, and you're paying for him, right?
Yeah.
You're paying to see Wilt Chamberlain play. And you're paying, as much as you can because you're like, I want to see Wilt play,
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, someone comes in and they say, okay, we're going to distribute, the pay because Wilt isn't that good, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And, the idea is like, if you're going to have Wilt Chamberlain, you have to have like an equality of value through transaction. But it makes no sense because it's like, think about Wilt Chamberlain, like Wilt Chamberlain has at least 60% of his money was stolen from him through like middlemen already of like agents, like people who like he really didn't need that were just set up as a profession, like accountants, things like that. It's like Wilt Chamberlain is this example that he uses as like the best of the best, right? Like athleticism wise. But it's like, even in his real world example, the example doesn't hold up because it's like the actual Wilt Chamberlain was paid way below what he should have been,
Right. Wow. Yeah. Nozick, at least he had the decency to sort of, I don't know, have a, end of life sort of. I had no idea that he had the sort of end of life work that he did, and I'm really looking forward to reading that because
it's interesting. It's really interesting.
You don't often get that from these people, I mean, it's not like Schmidt wrote something like that in the cabin he was exiled to or something. Yeah, that's wild. Do you guys have any more criticisms of John Rawls? Can we think of any that we didn't mention here? I mean, there might be some. We don't have to do all of them, but any sort of powerful or profound critiques and notes, stuff like that.
I'm like going through my stuff, but
yeah, I'm going through my stuff here too, and I don't really see much here at all. So
I don't know. Biggest criticism is that he's taught too damn much.
Too much.
It's been thinking too much. Literally about wrong things.
Well, I found ChatGPT very helpful for this episode because I really did not want to go and sift through a bunch of John Rawls. I was perfectly willing and going to, and I have the stuff. I downloaded them. I was like, yeah, this is okay. I got Theory of Justice, got Political Liberalism, got the Cambridge Lectures, got Justice is Fairness, the thing you did in 2001. I was like, all right. And I was like, well, what's this thing that came out this week called ChatGPT? And I was like, oh shit, this is giving me all the answers I need for this conversation. This is great. I don't have to look at this shit, man. Yeah, there's, some of the John Rawls stuff, man. You guys ever met any like John Rawls stands other than professors? Like, do you have people that are these people exist among us?
They exist, and I'll just tell you exactly where these people are, and I won't give any names. They're political consultants to governors. They're heads of departments in military defense organizations. They're, consultants at McKinsey or maybe Boston Consulting Group. These are the type of jobs people take who I've met who accept John Rawls as their premise, and that always concerns me.
I think he's just kind of like the father of like leftist liberalism, and like at least like even if not explicitly, implicitly, that's where the whole notion of like, I wouldn't want to say like reparations, but at least like the like reparations in like this vengeful way of like, how would I say it? Like just doing like, oh, like, why are you in this bureaucratic government position? And it's like, oh, because, I picked myself up from my bootstraps, because no one else helped me. And so now my job is to make it hard for some, to like, reject some white kid through affirmative action, through some affirmative action committee. So I feel like it's mostly those type of people who, they have a lot of Nietzschean resentment. And they use Rawls as a way to justify it's like, actually, I'm being, I don't even think
I'm being good.
Yeah, I think it's just the way
what it seems like.
Rationally justify their position.
The people who quote Rawls will still be working at like Northrop Grumman or Raytheon. Like, these are people who are very smart. They're not dumb, but they went to college just like me. And it's crazy to see that the people who go to college are very, very willing to take a job for 6 figures at a military industrial complex job.
Just as before this episode, I was imagining John Rawls with Carl Schmitt looking over his shoulder as he wrote this stuff, and kind of picking at him. And I also had a thought of I don't know how Domenico Lacerdo might react if one was seated on a plane next to him and you just started picking his brain about John Rawls. And how upset Domenico might be. He might just pretend to not even speak your language at that point. But yeah, I also I had all these sort of hypothetical thoughts of I wonder, and this is a question that you guys might have some takes on, but someone like Gregory Lukács, the Destruction of Reason, who made the statement about how there are no innocent philosophers, that each of them has, through their work, contributed towards the rise of fascism. And in Destruction of Reason, he kind of goes along and points at all these different philosophers, right? But I wonder, if Lukács wrote on Rawls, I wonder what Lukács might have to say about John Rawls's role in sort of reinforcing fascism. And of course, Lukács is gone, and the timelines don't match up and all that stuff, right? But that's why these are hypothetical situations that I tend to think of and throw at my guests. We're sitting here and I have an imagination,
I think with that, it's just that to the degree that we affirm some sort of progressive narrative of history or theory or thought in itself, I think every thinker is gonna to some degree is gonna contribute to fascism. It's just easy to plug in any ideological framework. It's going to be harder for some than others, but it's really easy to plug in that ideological framework, and it's going to spit out, it's going to reinforce the critique. It's going to sublimate the critique to, reinforce fascism. And I mean, to what degree, is Rawlsian reinforcing fascism? And so, it reinforces it insofar as it's taken as the true ideological. It's just NATO realism is Rawlsian praxis. At the end of the day, that's really what it is. Why do we have NATO? They're not even watchdogs of the world. It's not even to create Western hegemony. It's literally to create a centralization of electrical power. At the end of the day, it's what's the bedrock of all nation states' power? It's oil. So what the fuck is
natural gas?
Yeah. It's not if it's not creating geopolitical, quote unquote, geopolitical stabilization. It's what the fuck is a war in Ukraine? It's distributed.
Why do they choose the states they do? My country isn't even considered a NATO state. It's a NATO ally because they know that if Russia took it over, they wouldn't want to be responsible for it. It's it's a whole framework based on geopolitical stability, based on a series of quantifiable numbers, oil barrels, natural gas barrels, also troops at certain levels. And it's will we be able to position things properly where we can stabilize these prices.
In that sense, it's incredibly materialistic if you think about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to say that the John Rawls liberalism that people want to express has no idea what goes on to stabilize the actual liberalism, which is, the terrifying reality of multiple intelligence agencies, multiple militaries, multiple, wars fought at the behest of stabilizing an idea as we, think about it in many ways. But in reality, it's the idea that justifies the material reality that we forced on people that we should really be thinking about. Not, through a veil of ignorance, would we accept it? It's like, it's not a veil of ignorance. We killed millions of people for it. Stop thinking it's a veil of ignorance.
This might be a hot take, but I think this is why, and I say this in I know it's controversial, and I say it because it is, but I think that the real winner of the ideological war, what's it called, post-Soviet Union collapse, is actually the Soviet Union, insofar as it's the bureaucracy, the bureaucratic oligarchy that came from the dying Soviet Union and turned into what we now call NATO, which is it's not even Western hegemony as much as it is bureaucratic realism that permeates the whole world. And I think to what you said, Young, which is it's one of Nozick's biggest criticisms. Which is we don't even know people are agnostic or even unaware to the degree by which the state that we would require to create that stabilized system to give them the style of living that they require, that they want to maximize.
They would never realize the equality of intelligence agency required. And that's what we've been born into, is an intelligence agency that's, and I'll say this, you don't have to believe me, but that's probably killed their president at least twice, that's literally not capable of a democracy, in many respects, is the result of, our inability to come to an actual real resolution as to what democracy is, and I'm talking about Rawls, I'm talking about, Nozick, but I'm also, in many ways talking about Marx too. It's like America has no possible, way of dealing with interpretively what's happened to it, which is a series of, you can call it psyops, or you can call it, clusterfucks, whatever you want to call it.
Rawls doesn't make any sort of allocation for was it realpolitik, that nation states will and do advocate for themselves, right? To advocate for better positions, more resources, land, all that stuff, right? And that internation conflict, the sort of anarchy of nation states, the sort of grand poker table where everyone is cheating. That this seemingly, distributed and fair system of justice would, it doesn't have any sort of conception of anything beyond its own borders. So when liberalism itself becomes a sort of monster that is NATO, that is the project of Western hegemony, or the assumption of sort of liberal universalism, that this system is in the sense the Fukuyama's end of history, that this is the only game in town, and that this is the only game that survived out fascism and communism, and you must sort of acquiesce to the post World War II world order, you know, all that stuff. Like, I mean, it's an incredible point. It's very like Paul Virilio of you to say that, like, you know, like this is an incredibly materialist philosophy when you look at it as sort of NATO realism. And you're right, the people behind the veil of ignorance are ignorant of like what actually takes to justify that positioning in the world. And you can even I mean, and this is stuff that's not like conspiratorial or anything. You can trace this back to like George Kennan's letter in which he, you know, said that we now control over like half the world's wealth at the end of 1945 and World War II, and we should strategically kind of make moves in order to maintain that advantage over the rest of the world. And so yeah, like this sort of this Rawlsian stuff that we've been making fun of, there is a sort of side of it that's a bit like dark and fucked up, and so
it's very insidious.
It's
very insidious, you know.
Guys, appreciate that. All right, so by way of rounding out, y'all, I'm just gonna throw you one last question here, and it's a simple question, but if you think that like if Carl Schmitt had 10 minutes in a room with John Rawls, what would he say to him?
To be fair, I don't think that Schmitt is too far, or at least they're cut from the same liberal cloth. At least that's how I read Schmitt. So I think Schmitt might disagree on a lot of things with Rawls. But I think where they would both like what's it called? Like,
where do they converge? Yeah,
where they converge would be that notion of like that state of exception, right? Which is I think it's just that mechanism by which you establish a state, you know, it's quote unquote for the people or whatever you want to say. But at the end of the day, it's establishing a mechanism that can maintain a certain sense of equilibrium. And I think to that sense, I think it's just, to me, Schmitt and Rawls speak to the same monolith of liberalism that has permeated, you know, the latter half of the 20th century, which is just that liberalism, like you mentioned in the Fukuyamian sense, is that, you know, there is no big ideological competitor to liberalism at this time. And I think that's the current theoretical dialogue that people are having, which is, what the fuck do we do now? Like, you know, it's that that Deleuzian quote, which is, you know, what weapons are we coming up with? What do we even have? What are the conditions of possibility under liberalism to counter it?
Exactly.
And I think that's just the framework. That's the reality of it. I think that Schmitt in the biggest sense is, you know, just as much as I think even Leo Strauss, which is the father of neoconservatism, even calls Schmitt a fucking liberal. And in that sense, I don't think that they would fight as much as they would be like, oh, actually, you seem like a cool dude.
Yeah, I think that's so extremely right. I really like what you said. Cute. I really think that's absolutely correct, because I think that the political theology of liberalism is completed through Rawls. And I think if you're asking me what Rawls would say to Schmitt, or what Schmitt would say to Rawls, is Schmitt would say to Rawls, you know, you've done a great job. And Rawls would be like, what? You know, like, I don't think Rawls realized what he completed in his lifetime, because, you know, and that's why I kind of bring up my own personal experience with this, because like, I thought college would be more than John Rawls. Is that crazy to say? Like, I thought I would learn more than John Rawls. Like, in my academic career, I had to read Marx largely outside of all academia, which, like, people will never agree with you. The conservatives will say, "Oh, you got radicalized." It's like, no, I got radicalized in the wrong direction because college tried to radicalize me in many directions, conservative and liberal, and neither of them made sense as to what I was seeing around me, And I think the thing about Rawls that completes the political theology idea is that it's a liberalism large enough to be considered doctrine. Does that make sense? Like it's now doctrine. And that's why he completed what Schmidt would consider the basis for an entire theology of political science that is currently coming out of the Rawlsian tradition in the leftist America that is kind of destroying us on many levels, because it's turning everyone into a Rawlsian zombie of centrist liberalism that will not even accept the tenets of fucking Rawlsianism in the first place. Like the idea that we should at least have, like 75% taxes on the richest of the rich,
Right. Yeah, that's like Americans believe in the Rawlsianism, but then like refuse to accept the Rawlsianism that is offered to them in a way.
Right.
It's like we're sitting around waiting to reject justice as an end, It's like all these activists, like, I don't know, like protests, whatever, and they're like, here's your stimulus check. And they're like, I don't need a fucking stimulus. I work for a living. What are you talking about? It's these other assholes out here. And it's like under these sort of like contradictions, it is maddening to even, I don't know, to, like you said, to have this sort of doctrine completed in a way, to have this sort of civic religion in place, to where like the fucking statues of the goddamn forefathers intended you to get this stimulus check because you're a fucking American, and you got to stand there and be like, I work for a living, man. I'm too proud for this. Dude.
I know.
It's fucking amazing. It's like Ranciere doesn't even work at that point. Like that, you can't even presuppose that you're deserving of any sort of justice as an end or equality. It's like,
and God forbid you're starting at the wage and being like, wage labor is inherently immoral. People are like, well, I work for a living, like you're saying, It's like, but you're getting paid 70% less because that's how your employer makes money, and they're just like, well, I like working. And it's like, me too, everyone likes working, we like to do what we want to do and to work at what we like. But it's like the idea of surplus value has been so disconnected from the American working class that it's not even like feasible at this point to like even talk about it, because like if you go to college, you're not even going to be taught that. Like I wasn't taught Marx at all at my institution, studying philosophy, politics, and economics. Don't you think you should learn Marx if you're thinking about those things? Like that's insane to me. Like I had to learn that on my own. That's a crazy consideration for understanding how we should think about these topics. I'm not saying you should be a Marxist, right? Like God forbid I am a Marxist, but I do believe that everyone should actually have to contend with Marxism, just like they have to contend with liberalism, and just like they have to contend with Austrian economics, economic conservatism.
Yeah, I mean, I just one thing real quick, and I'll let you jump in. I know you got something to say. Just that you can make it through an entire like political science coursework, and really not even like hear the name Vladimir Lenin or have to read anything.
Oh God! No.
When like the motherfucker killed the Tsar and founded the Soviet Union, and it's been like the dire, bitter enemy that shaped the way the world is for the last decades, and I had to go like seek that guy out, like some sort of like illicit book that I bought thinking that was a list at that point. And I have a Lenin book, and I have people that come over and they're like, you're reading Lenin? Really? And it's like that not only do you have to go out of your way to find the dude, learn about him, find his work, etc., but then you do, and people think you're like all of us, like you're just like, hey, I would like distributed justice and fairness and equality, and people are like, so you want to murder 500,000 people? That's what you're telling me.
No.
Yeah, it's maddening, dude. But like. Yeah, so I guess thank you guys so much for hanging out and talking to me, and again, we've had Young Ramen and Cute Numina here on the show. They are from the Decode podcast, and if you want a recommendation from me, their episode on Paul Virilio was excellent, and it provided a lot of really good food for thought, and so I thought it would be amazing to have these dudes on and talk for a bit. And I think it's been a really generative conversation, shitting on John Rawls, and I'm glad it went to this unexpected place where we started speaking to Rawls as a sort of hideous, sort of NATO-realism materialist sort of thing, because I didn't expect it to go there at all. But guys, where do we find you? Your podcast is like on SoundCloud or something. At least that's where I found it. Is that where most folks? That's where you want to send folks to find your stuff?
What's on all platforms?
It's on all like Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud. Yeah, wherever you want to listen, that's perfectly fine.
Sweet. All right, so we'll include links for that in the show notes. And I hope, dear listeners, you've got something of value from this. I hope that if you are a liberal, you're really brave for listening to this stuff. I hope you've sharpened your own sort of, ideological blade. I hope there's something that enhances your way of being in the world through this conversation. And as always, take care of each other. And I will catch you guys next time. Bye.